Thanks for having me. I told Naima that I needed a copy of the book just to have a security blanket, and if all else fails, I'll just read the chapter to you, and that'll take about 30 minutes, so we should be good to go. Like Heidi said, you can see the title of my presentation. I wrote about the selective buying campaign, which was launched in Durham, North Carolina in 1968. And when Dr. Clark approached me to write a chapter for this book, I really wanted to do something that was sort of near and dear to my heart. And I've been a Durham area resident for about 11 years of my life, and a Durham city resident for probably 6 of those. So it's a city that's really, really important to me. I've seen a lot of social change happen in the city over the years, a lot of economic change, and a lot of really good things going on there. And I really wanted to explore some of the history. I know that Durham was actually known for being slightly more progressive than other areas during the civil rights movement. And so I was curious to understand what that was. I did most of my work. What was interesting is that when I started researching, I was really fascinated by this idea of Black Christmas. And I'm going to get to what Black Christmas was in 1968 and how they celebrated it. And I wanted to do the entire chapter on Black Christmas. But what unfolded was that there wasn't really enough about that one event to warrant a whole chapter. So that sort of took me back exploring what led up to Black Christmas. And I worked with, surprisingly, the Durham County Library way more than, say, Duke University and UNC Chapel Hill. So that was one of the interesting parts of my experience, was that I've spent a lot of time at the public library in the North Carolina collection that they have there. One thing I wrote in the book was that there's a little section in the back where there's stories about how we conducted research. And one of the things I wrote about was just the value of our local libraries. We sort of forget that they exist and that they have deep history. The librarian that I worked with actually knew R. Kelly Bryant, who's one of the big leaders in this movement that I'm about to talk about, and even had phone numbers if I wanted to call friends and family that were involved in some of this stuff, and let me take I shouldn't put this on camera, but she let me take a dissertation home with me that was supposed to be kept only in the library. So there were a lot of things that working with the local library really opened my eyes to what our cities and our counties and towns are doing to preserve this history. So I was really impressed. Duke University was not even as helpful in helping me locate some records. I did use some of their archives, but they didn't have the knowledge and the local background. So it was a really fun experience. I was on my teaching sabbatical before pre-tenure teaching sabbatical when I did the project. So I'll move into what I'm about to talk about. But in July 1968, the Black Solidarity Committee was formed in Durham, North Carolina. This was an economic boycott. And I really wanted to look at strategic communication, and what I ended up looking at was sort of the communication efforts around the economic boycott. There'd been a little bit written about the boycott itself and how successful it was and sort of the financial impact of the boycott, but no one had really written a lot about the communication efforts and how the media helped this effort move forward. So that's really what I wanted to sort of look at, was how these messages were framed. So I did a lot of digging, and I'll just start with a brief history of the Durham civil rights movement. There was a larger movement going on, but specific cities and towns were having their own, sort of forging their own battles during this time. In 1935, the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs was formed, and other groups became really active, such as the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. So there were some groups that were really forming to sort of address some of the issues that there were concerns about. In 1957, there was the first sit-in at the Royal Ice Cream Parlor, and there's still, I drive by it most days, there's a sign that sort of shows where this happened in the city, so they sort of commemorate it. And so it was a really big part of this, of the beginning of the movement. The Howard Johnson's sit-ins sparked a lot more of the protests and things that were going on. About 1,000 people were arrested during the demonstrations, and some of the demonstrations did turn violent. So what happened, though, is that after 1963, there was this new mayor that came into Durham, and the protesters sort of responded more positively to him. He claimed that government would sort of address some of their issues, and he went to some of their churches and spoke to them kind of candidly, and so they were a little bit hopeful that things would turn around. In 1964, the Durham Interim Committee was formed, and this was later called the Committee on Community Relations, and it was made up of both black and white citizens to sort of address some of the inequalities that were happening. What happened, though, that between 1964 and 1968, the violence did start to pick back up. Fair housing was a huge issue in Durham, so people were concerned about the housing issues there, and that was one of the major things that was sparking some discontent. The Black Solidarity Committee was formed in 1968, and it was interesting because it was mostly citizens under the age of 40. So this was a really young group. It was led by Howard Clement, and Howard Clement was known and viewed as this sort of strategically smart and competent leader. He was the executive of a black-owned insurance company in Durham. So he had a lot of leadership skills and sort of really commanded a great presence with this group. R. Kelly Bryant would also play a crucial role in this movement as well. He was the treasurer of the BSC, which is what I'll refer to the Black Solidarity Committee moving forward. They weren't happy with how their appeals were being handled with the government, so they decided that they wanted to consider speaking with the Durham Merchants Association and the Chamber of Commerce. They felt that these leadership organizations would have more influence and could potentially get things done better than the government was at the time. Here is criticism from the New York Times in 1963 to sort of show you what they were leading up to. And they even called North Carolina the most progressive southern state. But they basically say that it hasn't advanced far enough to avoid the mass demonstrations. So there was still a lot of stuff happening there. So that was something that was published there. So the campaign development, they basically decided they wanted to potentially do this boycott, or they made these appeals to the Chamber of Commerce and the DMC, or the Durham Merchants Association. So they targeted on July 26, 1968, they issued this kind of 15-page memorandum. It was very specific. It outlined very specific demands in different areas for welfare, equal employment, stuff like that. And they basically issued that to the DMC and the Chamber. What happened in the Herald, which was the primary newspaper, we had the Morning Herald and the Durham Sun, so they had a morning paper and an evening paper. The Herald put the memorandum pleas on the front page of the paper. They also published the 15-page memorandum in full, which was which was really nice that they did that. The DMC and the Chamber just didn't really respond very quickly. They didn't really have much to say in response. And so basically the BSC put this boycott in place by July 28th. It was this very organized economic boycott. They started it geographically. So they basically, the Northgate Shopping Center was sort of where it started, and I live right by Northgate Mall, which is still existing. So it's kind of nice to see that part of history, but they targeted the stores there and said, don't shop at these stores. The Coca-Cola bottling company was one of the first targets as well, so not to support them financially. So they sort of started with with a small list of businesses, and what they did was they met each week and they just added more businesses to the list. So as things progressed, they make decisions about which businesses to keep including in the boycott. It was quite an interesting development. Here's one of their flyers that they issued that I suspect, and I believe this was one of their weekly meetings, where they made the decisions at West Durham Baptist Church. So they were super organized in that kind of regard and very strategic in what they were doing. And you can see they had the slogan, let's wear old clothes to win new dignity. So they were trying to get everyone involved. So to examine kind of the boycott, I looked a lot at interview transcripts with some of the leaders. There were archives at Duke, like I said, and then mostly media coverage in the Herald and the Sun. Surprisingly, the local media sort of had this ability to position the BSC sort of positively in some ways. I think the next slide, yeah. So this was their first plea, or this was the announcement of their pleas to the city of Durham, and basically said, this is what we want from you. And the Herald published this on the front page and sort of highlighted it there. And what I really thought was interesting is that there were some really interesting frames going on in how the media covered this event. One of the frames that I saw is that they really did emphasize in the media coverage that this was a nonviolent effort. So that was some of the focus of how the articles were written and positioned and framed, that this was really a nonviolent effort. They also, and the BSC, I give the BSC some credit for doing this very well, they basically position this as a black and white problem. So they not only said that black residents weren't getting equal treatment and didn't have access to housing and employment and things like that, they also included the underprivileged and poor white citizens as well. So they didn't limit it to just it didn't make it so much of a racial thing that they were addressing. This was the key message strategically, is that they kept reiterating that we really need to do what is best for our city, what is best for Durham. It's interesting, Durham has a lot of city pride today. There's a very collective sense of community there, and it didn't surprise me that years and years ago that same thought existed, that we really want to do what is best for Durham. So the Herald didn't always cover everything positively, of course. They also made a plea to the public and said, these are justified demands and valid grievances, but they really wanted the boycott to come to an end. So the Herald kind of took that position that the boycott should end. So they did have sort of an opinion on it. They basically said that the extremists of both races need to sort this out, and it would be best for Durham to do so. So while they provided a lot of coverage, they sort of did have a slanted opinion on how this should end. One thing they did, the Herald and the Sun did, was they also published things that showed the white support in the community. So this is an excerpt from, I think this was, I have it in my notes, a letter to the editor from 4 white residents. And there was a lot of discussion around what they called social leadership, and saying that the white citizens should assume social leadership in this movement. And here you can see we realize that the threats themselves are the result of many years of inaction, and we recognize that some time is required. We request that we meet these legitimate demands. So white citizens were saying, this population, this group of people has really legitimate demands and should be treated equally. So there was a lot of interesting stuff there. They often did not, they got the local schools involved. So they went to Duke University, for example, and also tried to get them to support the economic boycott. So the YMCA and the YWCA also supported the boycott and actually backed it, which was interesting. And they didn't even really mention race as part of their reason for backing the boycott. They mentioned that this is part of our Christian heritage and we need justice, freedom, and dignity for all men. So they didn't even position it as a race issue here. And it compels us to strive for equality in all areas of life. And again, this was one of the notes or the appeals to Duke University, was that we are fighting for equality and restitution for all of Durham's citizens. So again, positioning this as something that's best for the city and all citizens in the city. They also, basically said there's a slowdown of the buying in Durham, and we want to continue that. We want the Duke students to not shop at these places. And actually a lot of white citizens started participating in the boycott as well. The students were pretty active. They distributed lists of the stores that should be boycotted and sort of have stood behind it. So that was a really interesting piece as well. So meanwhile, the Chamber and the DMC started meeting with the Black Solidarity Committee because they were getting so much pressure. The meetings were somewhat unproductive. They did form the Human Relations Commission, and they offered, the Durham Merchants Association offered to employ more black citizens. So they sort of said, okay, well, we'll try to help you guys with employment. The BSC didn't back down and kept adding stores to the list, and they said they were going to do this until all their grievances were met. So they kept adding, and they cared about more than just employment. So they were like, we understand employment's an issue, but there are welfare issues, there are housing issues, there are all kinds of other issues. This is a photo from Black Christmas from the North Carolina collection on, I think it was November, I don't have the exact date. It was in November when they decided to have a Christmas parade. It was on the same day that they traditionally did the white Christmas parade in downtown Durham. So they organized a black Christmas parade as well in the city on the same exact day. So there were about 20,000 people that came out. It was a very peaceful event. They had, as you can see, a black Santa, which in 1968 I thought was a really cool thing. They threw out candy and just kind of celebrated with sort of joy, and also it was a reminder of like where you should do your shopping. So they were telling people for the holiday, we want you to shop elsewhere. They actually bused people to Greensboro and to other cities and towns to take them to other places to do their Christmas shopping. So I thought that was really interesting that they organized on that kind of level. So they were really protesting at a high level. There are a lot of, it's unclear how much of an economic impact the boycott actually had. There are some people that say about 20% of revenue was lost, and there are other people that speculate about $900,000 of revenue was lost. So there are a lot of different ideas out there about how much the businesses were really suffering. Here was a quote about Black Christmas from Ben Ruffin. So he was with the United Organizations for Community Improvement, and he was also a member of the BSC. And this was an interview with him conducted by, I think, a doctoral student at UNC Chapel Hill, talking about how strong it was. And, you know, they were so excited that people were just not coming downtown to shop and that it was sort of empty. And doing last minute shopping, they said nobody was downtown. So they were like kind of thrilled about that and felt really successful in a lot of ways. So the boycott did end on February 16th, 1969. So that lasted July through February. So it was a pretty significant amount of time that the boycott went on. In January, the chamber started to agree to do some things. They were like, okay, this is getting a little stressful for us, and we want to help you with fair housing and education. They also said they would help by bringing in some new developers to create more housing. And they basically decided that they had the same goals in mind. The Chamber and the Durham Merchants Association also wanted what is best for Durham. And so they sort of connected on that message. And I think that was sort of how they sort of started to come to the table to talk about things. They put the people, the BSC really put people in power on the spot to make some sort of stand on something. So in 1969, they put Black members on the housing boards. They also put some leadership in the school system. They created this work incentive program to help create more employment. Employment was really viewed as one of the major changes. And this is a quote, I think, from R. Kelly Bryant, that he saw that employment was really the major change, that all of a sudden they had jobs all over downtown. And a lot of history shows that there were a lot of Black-owned businesses during this time, and there was even a whole section of the downtown area that was supported by Black business or Black-owned businesses. So that was really exciting. The strategic, I think I left off a slide there. I thought I had a slide on this, but basically what I say in the chapter is that the key message here was that racial equality was not the Negro's problem, not the white man's problem, not the businessman's problem. This was Durham's problem, and they realized that Durham was unique enough to have more potential for better race relations. So it's really an interesting example of how a community came together, how media worked with the BSC to highlight some important frames that created a successful, a somewhat successful resolution. Obviously, it didn't fix all problems, and it didn't turn everything around, but it was a start, and it was an example of a nonviolent effort that really had some lasting change. So that's what I sort of explored and found. I don't know if that was 30 minutes or not. That might not have been long enough for you guys. But I am open to any questions that you have. I have stacks and stacks of articles that I had to weed through to find all the information and the story here. So it was really fun to go through this history, and I'm open to any questions that you have.
Julie, this was fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you know anything about why the newspapers immediately responded the way they did. Was there work done by the members of the group to cultivate the newspapers beforehand? How
It was a little unclear. That was what was really hard to find in the history. What I had hoped to find was very specific stories about the relationship of the BSC with the media, and I couldn't really find that. I did find evidence that they obviously had flyers and sort of distributed flyers throughout the city and to other people. I did have evidence that the BSC had some really strong leadership, so my thought is that they were very effective in communicating with the media. The Herald did take a position that the boycott should end, but they also wrote a lot about how we should, how our white citizens should assume social leadership to help out this community. So that was really kind of a missing piece that I couldn't really get together as much as I would have liked. I think that the BSC was generally happy about the news coverage in the sense that they were often on the front page. What was interesting when that article was released on the front page is that there was also an article criticizing violent efforts, and it was sort of tucked away. It wasn't, so typically news coverage during that time on a national scale highlighted violence. And Durham was sort of not doing that as much as I think what was representative nationally. And it's not really clear why. You know, they did have a columnist, and I can't remember his name. He was one of the, he was an opinion guide that was employed with the paper, and he was writing sort of opinion pieces. And he was definitely writing about this frequently to sort of get the discussion going. They were printing editorials from white citizens, so they seemed pretty open to engaging in the dialogue. They did sort of take a stance, you know, which I thought was interesting as well. Instead of just reporting on it, they sort of did say to Durham, hey, you guys need to like do something about this. But yeah, it's unclear. I couldn't find out how the relationship worked or whether the paper just naturally took interest in it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
What was and I know I should know this, I read the racial makeup of Durham, was it 50-50, or what was the racial makeup? And because I'm thinking maybe that had something to do with the coverage.
Yes, it could have had something to do with the coverage. It's not in my chapter what the racial makeup was, but I think it was around 60-40. And it typically, even today, is around 50-50 to 60-40 as well, with just as many or even more black citizens than white. I don't know, do you know, Kirsten?
I think 60-40 sounds about right to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it traditionally has been that way. It hasn't really shifted.
And what was the, I mean, I question for hours.
It hasn't been that long, really.
You're ahead of me.
I know, I just had a thought that I'm thinking that there may have been a correlation between Martin Luther King dying in 1968 and the impetus for this. And maybe that had something to do with I look at that as doing with the newspaper coverage because everybody was covering a lot of stuff then. Maybe that
It
might
could be
have
that
something to do
prompted
with
it. That was never directly stated.
Right.
The death of Martin Luther King was never written about in conjunction with the BSC and their demands. But it's a possibility that really did spur on.
Interesting.
Women, did you read the April coverage of King's death?
Did I read it? I don't think so. No.
I mean, it's just 2 months before all,
Yeah.
all this.
Right,
Sorry, 2.5
yeah.
months. But it would have been worth in terms of getting the immediate local
Yeah, the
context.
sentiment of that. Yeah, that's a good point.
But I interrupted.
Oh, no.
I'll come back.
I'm not sure I have a question that can be answered, but I'm melding a couple of things in my mind. Let me pull one apart and say, so I'm wondering about the makeup of the writers of the Herald. In that regard, I think it's connected to the muddier part, which is that I think my experience of Durham's history is that it has always valued Black business and Black involvement and leadership in a way that a lot of other cities that I'm familiar with have not. So was there already Black involvement at the paper that might have been made it more likely to be a more sympathetic?
Yeah, I think
Here.
it's a great question. The point is valid of like going back much further and actually seeing and tracing the news coverage that led up to this to understand it.
Was it a little more liberal leaning from
Yeah.
the start?
Or even just the local context. If it's not simply the news coverage, the patterns of relationships. I mean, I get that vibe too. But also, I mean, Durham's Black Wall Street, right? Like the thumbnail is
Right.
by 1900. Durham is the economic center of Black North Carolina.
Yeah.
It was.
And Wilmington is a Black political center, and then race riots and or massacre. And so Durham endures as a keep your head down, but strive for economic independence, economic center, cultivating relationships with communities with white leaders. That's a big center of white money and power. And those are the same folks then who are leading the BSC.
Yes.
So that history would seem to be really meaningful. I mean, this is the tail end of the Black Wall Street's influence.
And when did 147 get run through the downtown?
Come on, share the same brain.
Because 147 seems to me like the big destruction
Yeah.
of
It
Black
was.
leadership.
And I wanted
See,
to map that on top of this,
Yes.
and was confused about that timeline
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
We need to use our third brain.
Yeah, I think that would be important.
Yeah.
I know Edward Martin, the writer who was primarily covering the BSC's demand. I'm pretty sure he was white, and so he was very active in keeping the coverage kind of moving along and always sort of publishing stuff about it.
Anything more recently in the papers, like 50 years post civil rights? Some kind of follow-up in terms of relations in the city or anything like that?
Well, I think relations in the city is often a topic of discussion. We saw it with Duke. We see it with Duke a lot. So there's a lot of discussion about how Duke clashes with sort of the neighborhoods, and sometimes they turn that into racial discussion as well.
The flagrant racism of the Durham Police Department, which has been front page news frequently,
Yes.
with the racial profiling, I mean, shocking statistics worked up, to which the chief has not responded in any meaningful way. I'm not even talking about the Hispanic.
I know the kid who shot himself
but-
while handcuffed in the backseat of the car.
Right. But aside from that, there was a big study by a third party, hundreds of pages of
I didn't know
statistics. And you read it, it makes you like leap open. Like I think Black men are 3 times as likely to be searched without cause for routine traffic stops. There's the same exact rate of finding anything, but there's a triple the search rate, and therefore the numbers and the stops themselves are higher from the beginning.
This is currently?
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
very much
and there's
so.
been a big push connected to the Ferguson events to put to put already existing demands even further forward with the city government, city hall, and that kind of stuff. So this has been an ongoing conversation. But I think it's also an ongoing conversation because there's always been strong Black leadership in Durham in a way that some of their cities haven't had, despite efforts to the contrary, right? So, yeah, it's a confusing, and you know that stop ratio doesn't fit some of the economic differentiation because you know the Durham isn't a city where all the rich people are white and all the poor people are black. So
it doesn't,
it's curious.
yeah. Similar things in
Makes you weep over.
London and Paris as well.
Yeah.
It is fun to hear about that, I mean, and discouraging and all these things, as a Durham resident also. I really appreciate you know, getting those, helping make connections. I was not as enthusiastic about the white citizens profiled in your chapter as you were. I mean, they sounded an awful lot like some of the classic heart of the civil rights movement white moderates who simply want to stop disruptive protests, get the flow of money flowing again as quickly as possible, and not
White
actually
ministers.
grant all the most demands. And one of the keys is, even when granting demands, to maintain white leadership and control. So those calls for white social leadership don't, to me, sound like calls for white responsibility. They
Right.
sound like calls for
White control.
right control.
Right.
And even the air quotes, but they weren't air quotes because it's a newspaper, around the legitimacy of the demands.
Yeah.
You know, it made me feel like that was a pretty tempered or qualified kind of endorsement.
Yeah.
And that they might fit, rather than the cooperative best for Durham, in the Birmingham or Montgomery white moderate.
Yeah.
You know, putting the brakes on the most radical aspects.
And Charles,
Yeah.
and you bring something to my mind that I've noticed, and I grew up here, is that every time things like this happen, 68, blah, 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 the state of North Carolina always manages to have a human relations committee formed. I'm not lying, I'm serious. They did one when I was in high school, and it keeps going and going and going, and, you know, to solve the problem, so. They're very good at that.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, how it earns him the reputation of, oh, very progressive.
Yeah.
Until something needs to happen, and then we don't do anything. Well,
Yeah.
They're good at that.
the reason I was really excited about Julie's chapter was we were talking about this Black Christmas idea, and I know as an African American girl growing up in New Jersey, and not 1968, it was born 1973, the idea of Black Santa.
Yeah.
My dad, like we weren't taught to believe in Santa as kids because my father refused to have this white man bring gifts. And so I just was curious about other people's experience with that idea of Santa.
Well, that's-
Because it's so
That's what
such a
drew me
compelling-
to the topic, you know,
Yeah.
was this fact that this Black Santa like went through Durham and it was peaceful and 20,000 people showed up
Because
and
that's the magic part too. is
Yeah.
that there's like Black Santa, that's
Yeah.
magic.
so I thought that was pretty cool. And from a PR perspective, which is really what I'm looking at, is the communications around it. Like that was sort of a publicity stunt that was pretty successful in some ways. It sort of rallied people's interest. And there were other groups marching in the parade. There were hospital volunteers. There were Boy Scout troops. So there's evidence that there were white people marching in the parade as well. So
I keep thinking that about the Christmas parade thing, that when I was like in middle school or junior high school maybe, we had a Black Christmas parade and a white Christmas parade. And I think, and if I'm not mistaken, the Santa Claus was Black. I'm seriously trying to remember that. I remember us going to the parade because it was always, every float in there had a Black person on it, you know, it was all that kind of stuff.
Well, even our pod in the office for the holiday, we put up Christmas stuff and then we searched like crazy through this county looking for a menorah. Looking like we've called it like menorah. What's that? Like, oh my gosh, you're Walmart, you know menorah. And then I always bring in the Black Santa because I want the Black Santa in the pod. Even here in McEwen, I want the Black Santa.
It's always strange when we go to Ghana, we're there right after the holidays, and so it's January, and over there, you know, population is black, but the centers are all white that are being sold.
wow.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
Really?
yeah, calendars and just Christmas Eve.
Interesting.
White centers, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Of course, in my class, I was talking about Kwanzaa one day, and the only student who knew all about Kwanzaa was this little redhead kid in the back. I was like, well, that's good, Peter.
I had wondered just in terms of context, how much comparison you did of some of these strategies to strategies elsewhere. Some of them sound pretty familiar, but I did,
Yeah.
wondering how many Black Santas there had been, what's Julian,
Yeah, I think that's a great
Julian Bond up
question.
to at the moment, because
Yeah.
you've been, doing communication strategy at this point for, 8 years, so there's a message there, and there's even in the last 3 years before this, there has been a turn to issues of economic justice that can't be legislated in the same way,
Right.
and so there's national messaging too, and I was wondering about the fit.
Yeah, it wasn't the scope of the project, but I think it's a legitimate piece that could be added to this that would provide some substance. I know that Black Christmas was made the newspaper in South Carolina, so they were writing about it in another state at least. I did find evidence of that. There wasn't national coverage of Durham's Black Christmas that I found evidence of, but there was some regional coverage. So yeah, it's a great question.
I'm just trying to figure out what's special about the Bull City.
I know. Everything is special about it, and I think that's the thing is that it just reconfirmed like my thoughts about it.
I feel vindicated.
Yeah, like I just feel like okay, back then they were doing the same things that we're trying to do now. And
Although I would say part of the stressor is right when there was the quote up about you had a quote up on your slides, and I was like, you could say that about
right.
you can say that right now.
Yes.
Exactly what's happening right now about we have the tolerance for a mass uprising demonstration, but not the means to
stop.
right.
Yeah.
And that's where we are right now.
I agree that it makes you wonder like how.
Plus ça change, plus ça la même chose.
Yeah, is there progress, or
Yeah.
if we're still sort of discussing the same thing?
Back to Jermaine's point about we always have a human right? Like, are we just spinning on the wheel?
Well, it's not coming back up.
Well, that's the thing that came to mind in your slide that had the different dates of the changing civil rights activity in Durham, 35, and then 58, and then 68. It's like, why does it always take so long?
So long.
In a city with the first black-owned bank in the country, right? Like all these, there are all these things that make Durham
Did it beat
special.
the Richmond
I
one?
think it did. Yeah, that's the Durham Press. But like there's so many ways in which Durham was special in terms of that relationship and yet, right? So
It really is. Durham was, for the Black community, Durham was the Wall Street in the Southeast
Yeah.
for African Americans. They truly were. The other thing is that just came out in something that, and this has nothing to do with your talk, that Durham Public Library and the North Carolina Library Archives or whatever has just published a link about jazz, music in Durham. It is really, really cool.
Clarence Tate Mouth Brown, you got more.
Yeah, there was because music was very important,
Yeah.
and a lot of gospel music and whatever started in Durham. So music became that music mecca in Durham too.
Well,
So
Branford
not only the
right.
money part,
But Branford Marsalis could live anywhere in the world, and he lives in Durham,
right? So,
in a golf course.
right.
And so did the freeway go in?
That's what we
We
can't
were
remember.
at
Trying to
That was
validate
I
Urban
think
improvement
the
timeline
biggest
question mark.
successful
Yeah.
strategy against black leaders.
So
in the city.
when the and what's interesting is that it was just this last year that they built that bridge over the freeway.
yeah.
And I think symbolically for a lot of people, they were kind of like,
Yeah.
you know, you guys trying to like
We're building a
bridge the
bridge.
gap. It doesn't remove the freeway that you put to divide us,
Yeah,
you
you can't
know.
bring back those homes that
That
were
was
taken
called,
out.
that was called urban renewal.
So they
Yeah.
basically, the Durham
That's urban
freeway,
renewal.
they basically installed it in a way that segregated black business and black communities from the white.
When did that happen?
That's what we're trying to remember,
No,
is
I'm
what
looking
year that
at,
happened.
school
But just this
desegregation
last year, they
in,
invested a
Durham.
couple $1 million, I think, to build that bridge.
Yeah, they're making
Yeah.
that the tobacco trail that's gonna
Yeah.
connect more of Durham through pedestrian and bicycle
The
lanes.
same identical thing happened in Greensboro. So if you look at interstate where I-29 bisects Market Street, which was the black part of Greensboro, they did the same thing.
Mhm.
It's urban renewal.
Yeah.
You know what is, I was thinking integration of this story into all those other timelines. I just looked up, we had a history graduate a few years ago who just won a National Teacher of the Year award, and while he was busy teaching high school in the public school system in Durham, he wrote a book on desegregation, which was decided in 68, 69, so late in the game, but contemporary with this timeline.
Right, right.
And enacted in the 70, 71 school year. But, you know, all the storylines fold together, right? They may
Yeah.
not be having to have all the same fights rhetorically here because they've just had them about school immigration or because they've just had them about, you know, X, Y, or Z or urban renewal or so. Yeah, you know.
The word goodwill appeared a lot, and I wrote about that a little bit in the chapter, but that word was used a lot in the news coverage and a lot in sort of the editorial stuff as well.
Sorry, you did not see that.
I mean, I did, I loved it.
I'm just wondering about one other thing. It's a bit related to, I think, Kirsten's question about you were talking about the makeup inside the newspaper. But you said the writers or the editorial, largely it was kind of white.
I'm pretty sure that, yes, Edward Martin, I think, was white.
Was white. And I'm just wondering about his kind of, if you knew anything, or perhaps this could be a future thing, about his social milieu.
Yeah.
You know, presumably in Durham you would just meet black people, you know, who would have obviously been in contact, but, you know, it would be interesting to know, and I don't know if you know anything about his social milieu, whether, you know, he had any black friends or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, you know, to understand that. And yes, like I do have black friends in Durham and live among black and white citizens in my neighborhood. So, you know, a lot of neighborhoods are pretty multiracial, which is fantastic. But you know, I will sort of, and what I'm sort of thinking about is that I will say that this was written from a place of optimism, you know, like the bias here is, even though I try to remove that and explore and look for the problems, the bias is sort of from wanting to believe that Durham, you know, was really coming together. And so, you know, I think that is sort of, you can sort of see that a little bit. It wasn't something I was really aware of as I was conducting the research, but when you take a step back, you know, you can see that there was like, I had the Durham county librarian was like so optimistic about the story, and you know, she thought everything that was going on during that time was a great thing, and she knew some of the people that were active. So there was a lot of optimism and positive feelings during this research. So I didn't go in with sort of a negative, you know, like I want to explore what went wrong. So, but I think it would be legitimate to try to remove a little bit of that bias.
I just have one more question. So the two newspapers that was one of them black? I can't remember.
The Herald and the Sun.
Yeah, because I know most North Carolina cities of size had a black newspaper, and I couldn't remember the name of the Durham newspaper.
I was wondering the same thing,
Because I knew almost every like, I'm sure they had a black newspaper.
Yeah.
So that's why I was wondering if they covered it in a black newspaper, or if one of those was a black newspaper that you were talking about.
the longstanding black newspaper in Cincinnati, which was lost only within the last decade, was the Herald.
Right. A lot of them are leaving well, because of technology and stuff too, but.
The Durham Freeway began with a 1962 bond referendum.
Okay.
The first section of the road completed in 1970. It was designated I-40. The original
Oh, okay.
section extended from Chapel Hill Street to Alston and resulted in the destruction of a portion of the Haytime neighborhood as part of urban
Right.
renewal.
I told you, urban renewal.
Though a DOT engineer said the neighborhood likely would have been torn down anyway,
Yeah.
one way or the other.
Yeah.
And it's that section of the East-West Expressway is named the I.L. Buck Dean Freeway, which to me is like adding insult to injury, because who is I.L. Buck Dean? I don't even know. You know, he's certainly not one of the Durham greats that we know, whose names we know.
Maybe he helped get the thing passed.
So it was 62, but built in 70, so right around
Early
this
70s, yeah.
time.
Interesting.
Yeah. Interesting. The book has another chapter written by someone who was a doctoral student at UNC Chapel Hill about a boycott of movie theaters in Greensboro, and it's really interesting that a lot of the same names and people are kind of woven through both stories in the time. And then there's other chapters based in the Civil War, and then I've got the chapter I contributed was after the death of Martin Luther King and James Brown's influence in the Black community.
Yeah. I loved how they met weekly and strategically decided like what store to add to the list. I thought that was a really interesting piece of the history of just like, yeah.
There's an organizing frame of mind in Durham. I
Yeah,
really like.
yeah.
I want to just thank everybody for coming. If you have more questions, we can do that informally. I also want to thank Jill informally. Thank you for giving her time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.